Caden Voss stared at the glowing message on his sleek holoscreen, the stark blue letters burning into his tired eyes. His untouched coffee sat forgotten, cooling beside a stack of abandoned research notes and empty food wrappers. The Galactic Concord's integration mandate notification blared on the screen. Notice of alien placement. 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in sanctions. Damn it, he muttered, raking a hand through his messy black hair. His apartment was a cluttered mess of discarded data pads, half-empty drink containers, and the haunting echoes of a once-organized life. Outside, the chaotic symphony of New Chicago filled the air, hovercars whooshing past, the hum of neon signs and the roar of protesters. A glance out the wide window showed two clashing groups gathered below. One side waved bright orange banners emblazoned with the slogan "Earth for Humans." They chanted in angry unison, their voices carrying the resentment of a planet forced to integrate alien refugees. Across the street stood the unifiers, their teal armbands glowing faintly as they countered with cries for peace and coexistence. Caden's communicator buzzed sharply. "You seeing this, Caden?" Elliot's voice crackled over the line. "Hard to miss when it's practically in my living room," Caden replied, his tone as dry as the burnt coffee on his desk. "You get your notice?" Caden sighed heavily. "Yeah. 2 of them, apparently." A low whistle came from the other end. "2. They must really think you're up for it. Most of us just got 1. Journalist, remember?" "Used to be, anyway," Caden corrected bitterly. He hadn't written a word since losing Sophia. "They probably think I'll spin it into a puff piece for the Concord. Idiots." Elliot hesitated, his voice dropping. "Listen, just be careful, okay? Some of these aliens, they're not all friendly. You hear what happened up north?" "Yeah, I heard." Caden ended the call before the guilt could creep in. Caden's apartment was modest but spacious enough for someone who lived alone. 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchenette he rarely used, and a living area dominated by hollow screens and stacks of forgotten projects. A cleaning drone hummed around, doing its best to tidy the chaos. His gaze fell on a framed photo on the cluttered shelf. In it, Sophia's radiant smile and bright green eyes shone as she leaned into him. The memory hit like a gut punch. Next to her stood Declan, his former partner, the man who betrayed them both. Caden slammed the frame face down and rubbed his temples. The protests outside grew louder, their chants a battle cry for the divided city. His holoscreen flashed with more updates. Placement details, 2 Naeran females. Arrival scheduled, 0900 hours. Naerans, he muttered, pulling up the species profile. The once dormant journalist in him stirred as he scanned the file. Humanoid, violet-hued skin, advanced tech-savvy culture, and a history of civil war. The details were vague, sanitized by Concord officials, but whispers from his investigative days told a darker story. His eyes lingered on the final line of the mandate. Failure to comply will result in immediate sanctions. The morning arrived far too quickly, and with it, an uneasy silence that lingered in Caden's apartment. The protests had died down during the night, but the tension outside remained palpable. At precisely 0900, the door chimed. Caden opened it to find 2 Concord officers flanking a pair of figures in gray cloaks. The taller officer, nameplate reading Carter, offered a curt nod. "Mr. Voss, your assigned residence." The cloaked figures stepped forward, lowering their hoods. Caden's prepared greeting caught in his throat. The Naerans were stunning in an alien, otherworldly way. Their skin shimmered with a faint purple glow, catching the sunlight that filtered through his windows. One stood calm and composed, her silver-violet eyes scanning him with polite curiosity. The other, however, bristled with barely concealed irritation, her arms crossed as she sized up his apartment. "I'm Naera," said the calmer one, her voice smooth and melodic. She dipped her head slightly in greeting. "This is my sister, Kaelina." "Charmed," Kaelina muttered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Her sharp, electric blue eyes darted around, her posture rigid and defensive. Carter cleared her throat. "Standard integration period is 6 months minimum. All parties are expected to comply with Concord regulations." "We know the rules," Kaelina snapped, cutting her off. The officer gave her a tight smile before turning back to Caden. You have our contact info if there are complications. With that, the officers departed, leaving Caden alone with his new roommates. For a moment, silence hung between them. Welcome, Caden said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Generous of you, Kaelina quipped, dropping her bag on his couch with an audible thud. She threw herself onto it, making herself at home. Naera sighed, giving her sister a pointed look before turning back to Caden. We appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Voss. It's Caden, he corrected. Her lips curved into a small, polite smile. Caden then. Thank you for allowing us into your home. Kaelina snorted. We didn't exactly give him a choice. Caden raised an eyebrow. And what exactly makes you think I'd throw you out? Kaelina's gaze turned sharp. Because most humans don't want aliens in their space, let alone Naerans. Kaelina, Naera warned softly, her tone carrying the weight of authority. Caden's instincts flared. What exactly makes you so different? Kaelina's jaw tightened. The kind of background that makes people uncomfortable. Naera cut in quickly, her voice soothing. It's complicated. And not something we'd want to impose on you. Outside, a new round of protests started up. The faint chants filtered in through the walls. Caden saw both sisters tense at the sound, their alien grace momentarily giving way to something raw and vulnerable. He turned back to them, his voice quiet but firm. Look, I don't care who you are or what you've been through. If you're here, this is your home now. Naera's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, her guarded expression cracked. There was something deep, ancient, and pained in her silver gaze. You're kind, Caden. But you don't know what you're offering. Kaelina laughed sharply, breaking the moment. Yeah, you might want to hold off on the whole welcome home speech. We're not exactly the ideal house guest. Then maybe you should tell me what I'm in for, Caden shot back, his journalist instincts taking over. Kaelina leaned forward, her smirk sharp as a blade. Careful human. Curiosity like that tends to get people hurt. Caden's stomach twisted. He didn't need the reminder. He knew better than most what curiosity could cost. For now, though, he simply nodded. Rooms are down the hall. Make yourselves at home. As the sisters retreated, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just invited more trouble than he could handle. Chapter 2. Unpacking Secrets. The tension in Caden's apartment didn't dissipate after the sisters settled in. If anything, it thickened. Naera unpacked her small, efficient bag in silence. Everything about her movements was calculated, graceful, and deliberate, like she was used to operating in hostile environments. Caden had seen that kind of body language before. War survivors, whistleblowers, people carrying scars deeper than they let on. Kaelina, on the other hand, sprawled across the couch with the air of someone trying too hard to appear relaxed. She tossed her cloak over the back of a chair and kicked off her boots, revealing sleek black leggings and an intricate set of swirling tattoos climbing up her ankles. She played with a hollow disc, tossing it up and catching it, her sharp blue eyes flicking over to Caden every few seconds. It wasn't just tension. It was calculation. Do you always stare at your guests like they're case files? Kaelina's voice sliced through the silence. Caden blinked. I'm just trying to figure you out. You didn't exactly come with an instruction manual. Kaelina snorted. We're Naerans. What else do you need to know? We're good at tech, bad at making friends, and apparently terrifying to Earthlings. Kaelina, Naera said, her tone both sharp and weary. What? He's gonna find out anyway. Kaelina turned her attention back to the hollow disc, spinning it on her fingertip. Might as well rip off the bandage now. Find out what? Caden asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. Naera shot Kaelina a warning look before turning to Caden. Her silver-violet eyes held his for a long moment. It doesn't matter. It does if it's going to affect all of us living here, Caden pressed. Kaelina let out a bark of laughter. Living here? Oh, you're adorable. You think this arrangement is going to last more than a week? Caden's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for this either, but we're stuck with it. So why don't we just put everything on the table? Because some things aren't your business, Kaelina snapped, her playful demeanor evaporating. Her voice dropped, venom lacing her words. And some stories end with people dead. The room went silent. Naera stood, smoothing the fabric of her simple gray dress. Her movements were calm, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Kaelina, that's enough. Kaelina stood too, the air between them crackling. For a moment, Caden thought they might start yelling, or worse, but instead Kaelina grabbed her boots and headed for the door. Where are you going? Caden asked. Out, she said without looking back. You can't just... The door slammed behind her before he could finish. Caden turned to Naera, who had crossed her arms and was staring at the door with an expression he couldn't quite read. Is this how it's going to be? He asked. She'll cool off, Naera said quietly. That's not what I'm asking. I want to know what's going on with you two. Why is she so hostile? And why do you look like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop? Naera hesitated, her hands tightening around her arms. For a moment he thought she might tell him. But then she looked away, her expression closing off. It's complicated, she said softly. Caden sighed, running a hand through his hair. Everything's complicated these days. Hours passed and Kaelina didn't return. Caden tried to distract himself by working on the half-finished projects cluttering his apartment, but his mind kept drifting to the sisters. Something about them was gnawing at him, tugging at the part of his brain that used to chase stories like a bloodhound. He pulled up the Concord database again, searching for anything he could find on the Naeran conflict. Most of the information was sanitized or redacted, but a few details slipped through. Their homeworld, Naera, had been one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy before it collapsed. Civil war. Corruption. Entire cities wiped out in targeted strikes. The Concord's involvement was limited to humanitarian aid, but whispers in the underground circuits told a different story. There were rumors of experiments, of people who had been modified. Caden leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. His gut told him the sisters were connected to those rumors somehow. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Kaelina walked in, her boots scuffed and her face flushed from the cold air outside. She didn't say a word as she headed for the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water. You okay? Caden asked cautiously. Peachy, she replied, not looking at him. Where'd you go? Why do you care? Because if something happens to you, it's on me, he said, his tone sharper than he intended. Kaelina froze, her hand tightening around the glass. Trust me, human. If something happens to me, it won't be your problem. Kaelina, Naera said softly, appearing in the doorway to the hall. Kaelina's shoulders dropped, and she set the glass down with a clink. Without another word, she walked past Naera and disappeared into her room. Naera sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. I'm sorry. She's adjusting. Adjusting to what? Caden asked, his frustration bubbling over. Look, I get that you have your secrets, but if we're going to live together, I need to know what's going on. Naera hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Kaelina's closed door. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. My sister and I? She paused as if searching for the right words. We're not just refugees, Caden. We're fugitives. The air seemed to leave the room. Fugitives? He repeated. Naera nodded, her expression grim. From our own people. From the Concord. From everyone. Caden's mind raced, 1,000 questions forming at once. What? What did you do? Naera's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of her fear. It's not about what we did, she said softly. It's about what we are. Chapter 3, What They Are. Caden leaned against the counter, trying to process Naera's words. His reporter instincts were firing on all cylinders, but for once he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover the full story. What do you mean, what you are? His voice was steady, though his pulse quickened. Naera hesitated, her silver-violet eyes flickering toward Kaelina's door. I mean, she trailed off, pressing her lips into a thin line. For the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely vulnerable. We're not like other Naerans. Caden crossed his arms, sensing there was more. You said you were fugitives? Are you criminals? Is that why they're chasing you? Naera shook her head. Not criminals. Survivors. Of what? She sighed, lowering her gaze. Experiments? Caden froze. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud, sending a chill down his spine. Experiments? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Naera nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. Our government wasn't as noble as it pretended to be. The Naeran elite were obsessed with perfection. Physical, intellectual, technological. But perfection comes at a cost. And you too were? Selected, Naera said bitterly. For a program that wasn't supposed to exist. Genetic modification, neurological enhancements, whatever they could think of to make us into weapons. Tools. And when we were no longer useful, we were marked for disposal. Caden stared at her, struggling to wrap his head around the magnitude of what she was saying. Disposal? You mean? They tried to kill us, Naera said flatly. Her voice was calm, but her trembling hands betrayed her emotions. Kaelina and I were lucky to escape. Others weren't. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the cleaning drone in the corner. Does the Concord know about this? Caden finally asked. They know enough to stay out of it, Naera said, her tone laced with bitterness. Naeran politics are messy, and the Concord doesn't want to get its hands dirty. So they look the other way while our people hunt us down. Why would they still be hunting you if you escaped? The experiments are over, right? Naera's gaze hardened. You don't understand, Caden. We're not just fugitives. We're evidence. Living proof of what they did. As long as we're alive, we're a threat to their power. Caden rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was more than he'd bargained for when he'd agreed to host the sisters. And now you're here. In my apartment. With a target on your backs. You think I wanted this? Naera snapped, her voice rising for the first time. You think I enjoy putting strangers in danger just by existing? We didn't choose this, Caden. It's survival. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden noise interrupted him. A muffled thump, followed by the sound of something shattering, came from Kaelina's room. Naera's head snapped toward the hallway. Kaelina. She was already moving before Caden could process what was happening. He followed her down the hall, his heart pounding. Naera burst into Kaelina's room without knocking, and Caden skidded to a stop behind her. The scene inside made his stomach drop. Kaelina was slumped on the floor, her back against the wall. A shattered glass lay in pieces near her hand, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. Her usually sharp blue eyes were unfocused, her face pale. Kaelina. Naera dropped to her knees beside her sister, shaking her gently. What's wrong? What happened? Kaelina's lips moved, but no sound came out. Caden stepped closer, panic rising in his chest. What's going on? Is she sick? It's not sickness, Naera said, her voice tight with worry. She pressed her hand to Kaelina's forehead, then checked her pulse. It's the serum? The serum? Naera didn't answer immediately. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial filled with a shimmering blue liquid. With practiced precision, she uncapped the vial and injected it into Kaelina's arm using a sleek, futuristic device. Kaelina gasped, her body arching for a moment before she slumped back against the wall. Her breathing evened out, but her eyes remained closed. Naera sat back on her heels, exhaling shakily. What the hell just happened? Caden demanded, his voice rising. The serum, Naera said quietly, cradling Kaelina's hand in hers. It stabilizes us. Without it, our bodies start to break down. Break down? It's a side effect of the modifications, she explained, her voice heavy with exhaustion. They made us stronger, faster, smarter, but at a cost. We're dependent on this serum to survive. Without it, the enhancements destabilize and... She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Caden stared at her, a mix of anger and helplessness bubbling up inside him. And you didn't think to tell me this before? What if you'd run out of serum? What if... I didn't tell you because it's not your problem. Naera snapped, her eyes flashing. We didn't come here to burden you with our problems, Caden. We came here because we had no choice. Caden took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. You're right. You didn't have a choice. But now we're in this together whether any of us like it or not. So if there's something I need to know, anything, tell me now. Naera looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she nodded. There's more to this than you realize, she said quietly. And if you really want to help, you're going to have to decide how far you're willing to go. Because once you're involved, there's no turning back. Caden swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. Life as he knew it was over. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Horizon. The next few days passed in uneasy tension. Caden tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy in his apartment, but it was impossible to ignore the constant undercurrent of danger that now accompanied his life. Naera was always on edge, her sharp eyes scanning every window and doorway like a predator watching for its next ambush. Kaelina, though recovering, was quieter than usual, her sharp tongue dulled by the episode that had nearly taken her life. The serum. The word lingered in Caden's mind, haunting him. How much of it did they have? How long would it last? And what happened if they ran out? He didn't want to ask, not yet. But he knew he couldn't avoid the question forever. On the fourth morning, Caden woke to the sound of hushed voices in the kitchen. He dragged himself out of bed and padded down the hallway, his curiosity outweighing his grogginess. Naera and Kaelina were sitting at the table, their heads bent close together. Kaelina's hair was damp from a recent shower, and her skin looked healthier than it had in days, but her expression was grim. Naera, on the other hand, looked as though she hadn't slept at all. "You're pushing too hard," Kaelina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't keep staying up all night like this." "I don't have a choice," Naera replied, her tone clipped. "If they find us, none of this will matter." Caden cleared his throat, announcing his presence. Both sisters looked up, their conversation snapping shut like a book slammed closed. "Good morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Or at least I think it's still morning. I didn't exactly check the clock." "Morning," Naera said curtly, glancing at Kaelina. Kaelina leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "You're up earlier than usual. Trouble sleeping?" "Something like that," Caden replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Though I'd wager I'm not the only one." Naera frowned but didn't respond. Caden set his mug down and crossed his arms. "Look, I've been patient. I haven't pressed you for details. But if I'm going to keep you safe, if we're going to survive this, I need to know what's really going on." "We've told you everything you need to know," Naera said, her voice tight. "No, you've told me what you want me to know," Caden shot back. "There's a difference." Kaelina smirked faintly. "He's not wrong, Naera. Maybe we should." "Don't," Naera interrupted, her tone sharp. She turned back to Caden, her eyes flashing. "The less you know, the safer you are. That's the only way this works." "That's not good enough," Caden said, his frustration boiling over. "You're not just putting yourselves at risk anymore. You're putting me at risk. My home. My life. I deserve to know what I'm up against." Naera stared at him, her jaw tight. For a moment, Caden thought she might lash out, but then her shoulders slumped and she let out a heavy sigh. "Fine," she said quietly. "You want the truth? Here it is. We're not just fugitives from the Naeran government. We're fugitives from the people who created us." Caden blinked. "What?" Naera leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The experiments weren't just about creating weapons. They were about creating control. The people who ran the program, they didn't just modify us physically. They implanted failsafes, triggers, ways to ensure we couldn't rebel." Kaelina shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "They turned us into living weapons," she said softly. "And they kept the keys to those weapons in their hands?" Caden's stomach turned. "You mean, they can control you?" "Not anymore," Naera said firmly. "We found a way to break free. But that's why they want us dead. If anyone finds out how we did it, if anyone learns how to dismantle their control, it could unravel everything they've built." Caden sat down heavily, trying to process what he was hearing. "So you're not just fugitives. You're a threat to their entire system." "Exactly," Naera said. "And now that you're here, they'll stop at nothing to find us," Kaelina finished. Caden rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Great. Fantastic. Just what I needed in my life." "We didn't ask for this," Naera said, her voice laced with guilt. "We didn't want to drag you into it." Yeah, well, here we are, Caden muttered. He looked up at Naera, his expression hardening. So what's the plan? Do you have a plan, or are we just waiting for them to kick down the door? Naera hesitated, glancing at Kaelina. We have a plan, Kaelina said, though her voice lacked confidence. Sort of. Sort of. We need to leave, Naera said. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely they'll find us. We've already stayed here too long. And go where? Caden asked. Naera hesitated. There's a safe house. Off-world. But it's dangerous to get there. We'll need help. Caden frowned. Help from who? A smuggler, Kaelina said, her smirk returning. You're a journalist, right? You've got contacts. Surely one of them knows someone who's good at getting people out of tight spots. Caden sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're asking me to dive into a world I've spent my entire career exposing? Naera's gaze softened. We're asking you to help us survive. Caden looked at her, at the haunted determination in her eyes, and knew he couldn't say no. All right, he said finally. I'll make some calls. But if this goes south? It won't, Naera said firmly. Caden wasn't so sure. Chapter 5. Deals in the Dark. Caden had spent years exposing corruption in the underbelly of New Terra, but now he found himself navigating it for a completely different reason. His old contacts didn't answer calls anymore, or if they did, it was to deliver curt refusals. The investigative journalist they once knew had burned too many bridges, stepping on toes for the sake of truth. But today Caden needed one of them to pick up. Late into the evening, after countless failed attempts, a voice finally came through his comm. Never thought I'd hear from you again, Holloway, said a gravelly voice on the other end. It belonged to Victor Renko, an information broker with more skeletons in his closet than there were stars in the sky. You got a death wish, or are you just that desperate? Victor, I need your help, Caden said, skipping pleasantries. Help, huh? You've got a funny way of asking for favors. Last time we spoke, you were threatening to write a piece on my extracurricular activities. Yeah, well, I didn't. You're still here, aren't you? A low chuckle echoed through the line. Touché. What's this about? I need a smuggler. Someone who can move a small group, quietly, off-world. There was a pause on the other end, and Caden could almost hear the gears turning in Victor's head. Off-world? Victor said finally, his tone skeptical. You running from something, Holloway? Not me. Just people who need help. Victor snorted. You always had a bleeding heart. Fine. I might know someone. But it'll cost you. Name it. Victor's chuckle turned into a full-blown laugh. Oh, this is rich. You're offering to pay? Caden Holloway, the self-righteous journalist, finally willing to play dirty? Just tell me what you want, Caden snapped. Relax, Victor said, his tone smug. You're lucky I owe you for keeping my name out of that expose. I'll set up a meeting. But if this blows back on me, you're on your own. Noted. Where and when? Victor rattled off an address in the lower districts, a place Caden knew well enough to dread returning to. Midnight. Don't be late, Victor said before the line went dead. The clock was nearing midnight when Caden pulled on his jacket and stepped into the living room. Naera and Kaelina were waiting, both dressed in plain, dark clothing that helped them blend into the shadows. Naera's expression was unreadable, but Kaelina looked irritated, her arms crossed. You're going alone? Naera asked. Yeah, Caden said, adjusting his collar. Less attention that way. Kaelina snorted. Or you just don't want us cramping your style. This isn't a game, Caden shot back. If something goes wrong, I don't want you too caught in the crossfire. Naera stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. Be careful. These kinds of people, they don't deal in favors. They deal in leverage. I know, Caden said, his voice softer. I'll be back before you know it. As he stepped out into the night, the weight of their trust settled heavily on his shoulders. The lower districts of New Terra were a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers and clean streets of the upper levels. Here, neon signs flickered in and out, casting an eerie glow over cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls. The air was thick with the smell of grease, smoke, and desperation. Caden pulled his jacket tighter as he approached the address Victor had given him. It was an old warehouse, its exterior rusted and weathered by time. A single light flickered above the entrance. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The interior was dimly lit, with shadows pooling in every corner. A group of figures stood near the center, their faces obscured by the low light. "Mr. Holloway," a smooth voice greeted him. A tall man stepped forward, his features coming into focus. He was lean, with sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Victor said you'd be coming? And you are?" "Call me Malric," the man said, extending a hand. Caden shook it reluctantly. "Victor tells me you need transport off-world?" "That's right," Caden said, keeping his tone steady. "2 passengers. Discreet?" Malric tilted his head, studying Caden. "Discreet, huh? That usually means trouble. What are you running from?" "Does it matter?" Caden replied. Malric smirked. "It matters if it's going to cost me more than it's worth." Caden clenched his jaw. "They're just trying to survive. That's all you need to know." "Fair enough," Malric said. "But survival comes at a price." "How much?" Malric's smirk widened. "Not credits. Information." Caden stiffened. "What kind of information? You used to be a journalist, didn't you? Digging up dirt, uncovering secrets. I need you to do a little digging for me. Find something I can use." "Use against who?" "That's none of your concern," Malric said, his tone turning cold. "You get me what I need and I'll get your friends off-world. Deal?" Caden hesitated. This was exactly the kind of moral compromise he'd spent his career avoiding. But as he thought of Naera and Kaelina, of the danger they were in, he realized he didn't have a choice. "Deal," he said finally. Malric's smirk returned. "Good. I'll be in touch with the details." "Don't disappoint me, Holloway." As Caden left the warehouse, his mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He'd just made a deal with the devil, and he had no idea how deep it would take him. Back at the apartment, Naera and Kaelina were waiting anxiously. "Well?" Naera asked the moment he walked through the door. "I found someone," Caden said, shrugging off his jacket. "But it's complicated." "Complicated how?" Kaelina pressed. Caden hesitated, looking between the two of them. "He wants me to do something for him first. It's risky, but if it works, he'll get us out of here." Naera frowned. "What kind of risk?" "I don't know yet," Caden admitted. "But whatever it is, it's our only shot." Kaelina sighed, shaking her head. "This just keeps getting better and better." Naera placed a hand on Caden's arm, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on us," she said. Caden didn't respond. He wasn't sure he deserved their gratitude, not yet. He just hoped he could deliver on his promise before it was too late. Chapter 6: Freedom's Price. Caden's contact, Malric, wasted no time providing details about the job. It was simple in description but dangerous in execution. Infiltrate the offices of Orion Syndicate, an organization controlling a large chunk of New Terra's underground economy. Malric needed proof of their ties to the Alliance's secret dealings, and Caden's journalistic instincts were being weaponized against his will. The tension in the apartment was palpable as he explained the plan to Naera and Kaelina. "You're going alone again, aren't you?" Naera asked, her voice steady but lined with concern. "I have to," Caden said, strapping a small comm device to his wrist. "The more people involved, the higher the chance something goes wrong." "You're walking into a den of snakes," Kaelina said, pacing the room. "How do you know Malric isn't setting you up to fail?" "I don't," Caden admitted. "But this is the only way to get you two off this planet. I'll deal with Malric and the fallout later." Naera stepped closer, her violet eyes meeting his. "Be careful, Caden. We've seen what desperation can do to people. Malric will use you until you're no longer useful." Caden offered a faint smile. "That's the plan. Let's hope I'm useful enough to get this done." The infiltration. The Orion Syndicate's headquarters was a towering building in the heart of the lower districts. It stood out among the crumbling structures around it, a gleaming fortress of wealth and power. Caden's heart pounded as he approached, his mind replaying the plan Malric had laid out. The key was subtlety. Slip into the building using a fake ID Malric had provided, access the upper-level servers, and download the incriminating files. Easy on paper, impossible in practice. The ID worked without a hitch, allowing Caden to enter through a side entrance. Inside, the halls were quiet, the soft hum of machinery filling the space. He moved quickly, avoiding the occasional security patrol. When he reached the server room, Caden's hands shook as he inserted the decryption device Malric had provided. A progress bar appeared on the screen, ticking upward at an agonizingly slow pace. Come on, he muttered under his breath. The door behind him hissed open. Caden froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned slowly to see a security guard, her expression hardening as she reached for her comm. No sudden moves, she warned, leveling a weapon at him. Caden's mind raced. He couldn't fail now, not when he was so close. Summoning all the courage he could, he lunged forward, knocking the weapon from her hand. A scuffle ensued, with Caden narrowly managing to subdue the guard. By the time he returned to the terminal, the files had finished downloading. He grabbed the device and bolted, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The deal. Caden met Malric in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the lower districts. The broker sat in a corner booth, a self-satisfied grin on his face as Caden approached. You look like you've been through hell, Malric said, gesturing for Caden to sit. Just give me your word, Caden said, slamming the device onto the table. You'll get them off-world? Malric picked up the device, inspecting it with a critical eye. Relax, Holloway. A deal's a deal. I don't trust you, Caden said bluntly. Malric chuckled. Smart man. But trust isn't necessary. The arrangements have already been made. A ship will be waiting at Dock 27 in 3 hours. Be there, or don't. It's your call. Caden stood, glaring at the broker. If this is a trap. It's not, Malric interrupted. I don't waste resources. Good luck, journalist. The escape. The three of them arrived at Dock 27 under cover of darkness. The ship was small but sturdy, its engines already humming as it prepared for takeoff. This is it, Caden said, turning to Naera and Kaelina. Naera looked at him, her expression conflicted. You're not coming with us, are you? Caden hesitated. I can't. Not yet. There's still work I need to do here. Kaelina folded her arms, her sharp gaze narrowing. You're staying to clean up Malric's mess, aren't you? Someone has to, Caden admitted. He's too dangerous to let loose, and now I know too much about his operations. He'll come after me eventually, but I'll deal with that when the time comes. Naera stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've done more for us than we could have ever asked. Thank you, Caden. For everything. He smiled faintly. Just promise me you'll make it out there. Live your lives. Be free. Kaelina smirked, though her tone was softer than usual. Don't go dying on us, Holloway. It'd ruin the story. As they boarded the ship, Naera paused at the top of the ramp, turning back one last time. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Goodbye, Caden, she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the ship's engines. The ramp closed, and moments later the ship lifted off, disappearing into the night sky.